No one suspected that a financial system that was praised as stable was built on a dark secret. It was not born to solve debt but to perpetuate it. The numbers that the media has been avoiding are gradually revealing a shocking truth. Every coin you hold, every transaction you make, is a link in a mechanism that has been meticulously designed for 3 centuries to keep the world from ever escaping the cycle of borrowing, paying back, borrowing again. This is not just normal economics. This is an invisible prison, where 4 powerful architects, Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan and Volcker, have long since locked the escape door, allowing humanity to be led according to a script they secretly prepared. If you want to understand the power play that is operating under the economic surface, leave a like to let me know you are with us. According to recent global economic reports, total world debt has surpassed $315 trillion, putting pressure on every economy from the US to Europe to Asia. The US alone is struggling with more than $38 trillion in public debt, while Japan, with $9 trillion, continues to rely on ultra-low interest rates to keep the system from collapsing. Many experts warn that this is no longer a debt cycle, it is the foundational structure of the modern monetary system. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. Because behind those cold numbers lies a secret mechanism that has been built over 3 centuries, where each crisis is just a link in a larger plan, and the inescapable debt system is the epicenter of the entire current economic order. In every war, the strong are often not on the battlefield, they hide behind pens, contracts, and seemingly harmless financial institutions. The economic confrontation today is no different. It begins not with gunfire, but with numbers, reports, loans presented as bailouts. And in the middle of this maze, 2 forces emerge, the oppressors and the rebels. One side has the money-printing press, the bond markets, the investment funds, and the global banking networks. The other has only sovereignty, resources, and the will to survive, not to be crushed in the gears of the system. The oppressor is not a fixed state, it is a power structure. An invisible but absolute structure, accumulated over 3 centuries. It began with Patterson, who first turned debt into an asset. Then Rothschild brought it across borders, making it tradable across borders like a commodity. Then J.P. Morgan elevated it to a model of infinite debt, where each new coin is a promise of future interest payments. Ultimately, Volcker turned it into a global interest rate shackle, a rope that could strangle any country that dared to stray from the dollar's orbit. That was the board they built, a board with no escape points. That was the card they played. Every crisis was an opportunity to consolidate control. That was the debt wall they built. The more they paid, the higher the wall got. That was the financial shackle they locked around countries, light as air but stronger than steel. But on the other side, small countries, weaker economies, communities struggling with inflation and deficits, began to ask, who designed this system? Why did debt balloon in ways no one could control? And why did each crisis lead to harsher terms? More loss of wealth, and more surrender of sovereignty? The answer was not in sweet talk. It's in the way the system works. When a country borrows, money is created from debt. But to keep money circulating, it must continue to borrow to pay the interest on old loans. Interest never disappears, it just swells over time. For countries lacking foreign reserves, especially US dollars, paying interest is like standing in front of a wave that never stops. Every year, the wave gets higher. Every night, they must pray that their currency doesn't lose value, their reserves don't run out, and their bond markets don't collapse. Meanwhile, the oppressors are in the opposite position. Interest is profit. Every dollar of debt in the world is not a burden to them, it's an asset. Every country sinks deeper, they get richer. Every debt crisis, they expand their influence. The rebels, whether they're African, Latin American, or Asian, are forced into this battleground with brutal asymmetry. Because when they try to break the cycle, international financial institutions immediately impose implicit sanctions through credit ratings, liquidity restrictions, or demands for economic structural adjustments, policies presented as reforms, but whose effects resemble a controlled dissolution. This is not negotiation. This is war without gunfire. No one said it, but everyone understood, since the Fed allowed governments to borrow indefinitely. The game had changed. Countries that borrowed dollars had to pay interest in dollars, but they couldn't print dollars. This created a cruel reality: they were chasing a currency that didn't belong to them. In a playing field where the rules were set by the oppressor, and every mistake cost resources, land, sovereignty, or the future of the next generation. And when Paul Volcker raised interest rates to unprecedented levels in 1982, the shock sent a series of countries tumbling like dominoes. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, many African countries, all of them went off the cliff. But instead of letting American banks suffer, the IMF stepped in. The bailout was thrown like a lifeline. But everyone knew it had a reverse pull. In return for help, they had to cut social spending, privatize state assets, open markets, allow foreign capital to freely enter and exit, and give up the right to decide their own economic path. It was then that the oppressors perfected the financial chains. But the rebel countries were not completely silent. In many places, voices began to ring out: why should we accept a system that was programmed to fail from birth? New financial movements emerged. From BRICS to non-dollar payment alliances, directly challenging the power structure that the four forces had built. In the darkness of the financial chessboard, a battle of wits was taking place. One side wanted to keep control forever. The other side wanted to break the chains and build a new path. The contradiction grew bigger and bigger, as tense as a bowstring. And the world is entering a period where a small decision by a small country can shake the entire global debt structure. If you believe that no country should be suffocated by an imposed economic model, share your thoughts in the comments. The world is facing a rift larger than any crisis on record. It is not just an economic rift, it is a systemic rift, a power rift, a rift in the way the global economy has operated for the past 300 years. On one side is a financial empire that has used debt as a weapon, as a leash, as a network of transnational control. On the other are rising resistance forces, demanding economic sovereignty in an era when sovereignty was once considered a luxury. This tension has been simmering for decades, but only in recent years has it exploded. For the first time since World War II, the dominance of a single monetary system, based on the dollar, is being directly challenged. Not just by countries trapped in debt traps, but by major economies tired of the instability created by the very mechanism they are forced to rely on. To understand the extent of this stress, imagine the global financial system as a giant spider web. At the center of the web are the institutions that control liquidity and capital flows: the Fed, the IMF, investment funds, and a small group of multinational banks. Each thread is money, each knot is debt, and each slight tremor at the center of the web reverberates around the world like a shockwave. When the Fed raises interest rates, the impact doesn't stop within national borders. It spreads like a war drum, waking up markets from South Africa to Indonesia, from Brazil to Turkey. Currencies fall, bonds fall, and capital flees. And when chaos reaches a breaking point, the IMF steps in, not as a doctor, but as an architect who recalibrates the power structure to the disadvantage of the weaker party. The oppressive structure understands this. It knows that as long as the US dollar remains the dominant currency of payment, as long as global debt is denominated in US dollars, as long as interest rates are determined by them, the world will remain trapped in the vortex of its design. That invisible thread is so strong that it cannot be cut by a single policy or political decision. It is deeply embedded in every transaction, every contract, every development plan, every growth expectation. But the global resistance can no longer accept a passive role. Debt-strapped countries begin to form alliances. Manipulated economies begin to build their own payment systems. Resource-rich countries begin to demand payment in local currencies or gold. And when they do, the centers of power feel the pinch, because all control rests on a simple truth: if the world doesn't need dollars, they lose the endless stream of debt revenue. Tensions are escalating as a new global debt crisis is predicted to erupt. Many countries are in a similar situation to the 1980s, but this time, they are not accepting bailouts in exchange for unconditional ties. Not accepting commitments to devalue their currencies, cut social benefits, sell off strategic assets. Not accepting the financial sphere of influence of previous decades. Meanwhile, on the other side, the financial powers are also feeling the heat. They are facing persistent inflation, huge budget deficits, and an unprecedented need for debt. That is, they themselves are becoming hostages of the system they built. When public debt exceeds their ability to pay, the options become limited: either continue to borrow indefinitely, or raise interest rates, or let their currencies depreciate. But in all three options, there is always a sacrifice. And that sacrifice can no longer be pushed onto other countries as before. The oppressive structure must now swallow the bitter pill it once forced others to drink. But no system will give up power gently. When power is challenged, the natural reaction is to tighten, increase control, and destabilize to restore the old order. The result is increased tension on all fronts. On the geopolitical front, economic sanctions are used continuously. On the trade front, tariff and non-tariff barriers are being erected. On the currency front, countries are forming non-dollar payment alliances. On the technology front, digital payment standards are breaking away from the old system. On the energy front, oil, gas, and mineral trades are moving to local currencies. These are not petty conflicts, they are a fight to regain control of real value. Amid all these waves, the scariest thing is not the collapse of a country, but the collapse of trust, the very foundation of money. When trust is shaken, any financial model, no matter how sophisticated, can snap like a dry branch. And right now, trust in the old governing structure is shaking. At major economic conferences, questions that were once considered taboo are now being put straight on the table. Why does a single reserve currency have the power to determine the world's interest rates? Why do every growth cycle end in a debt crisis? And why are those who cause crises always the ones who benefit? These questions do not come only from poor countries. They come from large countries, from radical economists, from multinational CEOs, from the very people who once contributed to the operation of the system. The global resistance is growing stronger, not just because it is united, but because the old structure has shown its limits. The world no longer has enough space to continue pushing crises into the future through unlimited borrowing. No longer has enough room to use interest rates as a tool of adjustment without causing a chain reaction. No longer has enough trust to maintain a system that concentrates power in a small group. Tensions have reached a point where a single unexpected event, a major default, an interest rate shock, a capital flight, could turn the tide in a matter of days. And in that moment, the world will face the most important question of all. Who will rewrite the rules of the game? While the world thought the global debt machine would continue to operate as it had for decades, another truth was quietly taking shape under the thick layer of ice in the old financial system, the biggest power shift since World War II. It was no longer isolated protests. No longer isolated voices in closed rooms. For the first time, countries burdened with debt, squeezed by interest rates, shackled by conditions for reform, had found common ground. They were not just victims, but pillars of a new order that was about to be born. And it was this realization that was the beginning of the global knot. For as weaker nations realize the weakness of the debt system, that the oppressors are only as strong as they are submissive, the financial earthquake begins to unfold. The chessboard of power has begun to shake from the smallest cracks. The most dramatic change has come not from political rhetoric, but from economic data. In recent decades, the United States and Europe have relied increasingly on debt to sustain spending. Government debt, corporate debt, household debt, all have ballooned to the point where they cannot be reduced without triggering a serious crisis. The whole system is like a giant ship, powered by borrowed fuel, and any slowdown could cause the engine to explode. Meanwhile, many once oppressed nations have risen strongly thanks to energy, minerals, young populations, and intra-bloc cooperation. From Africa to Asia, a web of economies is emerging without IMF approval, without credit rating agencies, without a nod from Washington or London. The twist of the times is this: one side needs the global debt system to survive. The other side wants to escape it to survive. And as one side tightens its grip, the other side tries to break the golden ring. A series of events have appeared one after another, seemingly unrelated, but in fact they are all links to the same change. From the movement away from the dollar in trade payments, to resource alliances renegotiating prices, From new loan refusal policies to countries daring to openly criticize the era of debt hegemony. Things that once appeared only in secret research papers have now become public policies. The tipping point is getting closer, because every small fluctuation creates a chain effect. The Fed's interest rate only needs to increase slightly, and dozens of countries will immediately fall into disarray. Energy prices only need to fluctuate, and the import costs of dependent economies will immediately increase. The USD only needs to strengthen a little, and their domestic currencies will plummet like falling rocks. No one says it, but everyone understands, the stability of the global debt system is built on the instability of the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the oppressors see the danger. They understand that if many countries simultaneously escape control, refusing to borrow more, switching to a new payment system, or demanding debt restructuring under different rules, the debt-fueled empire will be shaken to its core. Because the debt system only works when borrowers are afraid. If they are no longer afraid, the gears will break. So a series of new tools have emerged. Faster financial sanctions. Stronger restrictions on banking transactions. A flood of national risk reports. Media campaigns to portray every non-dollar move as dangerous. The old system is fighting back to prolong its life. But the resistance is also growing stronger. In many countries, the consequences of relying on foreign debt are clear. Schools are falling apart, hospitals are overloaded, currencies are losing value. Civil servants' salaries are falling, national assets are being sold off, tens of millions of people are slipping below the minimum standard of living. People are starting to ask, how much aid are we getting? And how much are we losing in return? When people wake up, governments have to change. At that point, the global knot becomes tighter than ever. Because if one country decides to break the debt shackles, the world will only shake slightly. But if dozens of countries do the same, the global debt system will shatter like glass thrown against a rock. Tensions are rising as the once weak countries themselves begin to hold what the oppressors cannot control: strategic resources. Oil, gas, lithium, uranium, bauxite, coltan, things that cannot be printed by central bank meetings. For the first time in modern history, the resistance has a weapon more powerful than interest rates: the right to determine the true value of resources. And this is what causes the equilibrium to collapse. Because when resources are no longer priced by Western exchanges, but by direct agreements between developing countries, power shifts. If prices are set based on fairness rather than imposition, all the structures built on the old system of buying cheap and selling high will collapse like sandcastles. More and more countries are starting to negotiate according to new models. Trading resources for infrastructure. Trading energy for technology. Trading minerals for market access. Or simply demanding fair market value. These agreements are the knife that gradually cuts the rope of debt. The global knot is now not just economic. It is a question of order. It is a confrontation between two wills. One that wants to maintain the old power at any cost. One that wants to regenerate history through economic sovereignty. No one knows which will happen first. The old debt system collapses because no one is obeying anymore. Or the coalition of rebel states is destroyed by the financial power of the oppressor. All we know is that both sides have reached the edge of the abyss. There is no way back. There is no middle ground. There is no postponement option. The world is at a historical juncture where a small decision, a sudden shock, a seemingly random chain of events is enough to push the entire system over the abyss or usher in a new era of autonomy. The knot has tightened to the point where it can no longer be pulled. And then, like an overstretched string, the world hears the first pop, the snap of a seemingly imperishable structure. It all started with a small country, not too rich, not too powerful, but bold enough to do what the global debt system considered an act of rebellion. They declared their refusal to accept another loan, to accept new reform conditions, to refuse to cut social spending as the IMF demanded. The world was shocked. But the shock was only just beginning. When the country publicly stated its reasons, we cannot continue to pay our debts when our children cannot go to school. When hospitals have no medicine, when farmers are going bankrupt every day, millions of people across continents saw themselves in that declaration. Their voices, for the first time in decades, were represented. And it spread like wildfire. Not a fire that destroys, but a fire that awakens. A week later, a second country does the same. Then a third. The chain reaction continues. Each announcement a nail in the coffin of the old debt system. Global interest rates fluctuate. The dollar wobbles slightly, enough to scare Wall Street, enough to force emergency meetings among the major banks. But what is more frightening is the psychology. The fear that fuels the system is being replaced by solidarity. On the oppressor's side, the response is immediate. Risk reports are released en masse. Credit ratings are downgraded, warnings of bankruptcy are splashed across the newspapers. But this time, the familiar tactics are no longer working. The people in those countries no longer believe the scaremongering. They saw the truth. They had been poor while paying their debts regularly for decades, so how was being poor because they stopped paying any more different from being poor because they continued to pay? That was when the system began to crack from within. The climax reached its peak when 12 countries, a shocking number, signed a joint statement, temporarily suspending international debt payments to prioritize domestic economic recovery. In just one night, the total amount of frozen debt exceeded hundreds of billions of dollars. Those who had controlled the world with financial instruments faced the risk of losing power for the first time. Major markets fell into a state of panic. Some large investment funds announced losses of tens of billions. Western central banks had to hold emergency meetings to prevent the domino effect from spreading. The media called this event the night of financial earthquake without the sound of bombs. While chaos engulfed major financial centers, on the other side of the world, millions of people poured into the streets to celebrate. Not to celebrate the chaos of others, but to celebrate their standing tall. Flags fluttered, songs of independence were sung, oaths were recited. We will not let our children's future be determined by the debts of others. It was no longer a protest. It was no longer a demand. It was a general economic uprising. And when the rebel nations reached the point of no return, the world faced a life or death choice. Either the old debt system be restored by punishing and isolating individual nations, or the system must be reborn under new rules, where debt is no longer a shackle, but a tool for equal cooperation. It was at this moment that history turned a new page. The climax broke out, not with bombs and bullets, but with the determination to break the unjust order. And once the climax broke out, no one could put it out. Because it did not come from a government, but from hundreds of millions of people. When the dust of economic confrontation settled, one final truth emerged, so clear that no one could deny it: the debt system did not collapse because of an external blow, but because the people inside stopped bowing. And that was the moment of history. The moment when humanity realized that freedom is never given, it only comes when someone dares to step toward it. Nations that had been on the sidelines rewrote their destiny by their own decisions. They did not win through financial might, but through the power of an eternal truth: no economic model can imprison and awaken people. And from the ashes of the old system, a new vision was born, where economics is no longer a weapon, debt is no longer a shackle, and prosperity no longer depends on squeezing the next generation. If you feel this story opens up a new perspective on economic power and freedom, please like, comment, and subscribe. Don't let this voice stop here. We have a lot of truths to uncover together. Because the journey to escape the system they designed so you never escape is just beginning.